we go again with the applause before I've even done anything. All right, wow. Quick question. Is there anybody here this morning that was not here last night? Okay, there's a few, maybe about 10 of you. Okay. So you heard Richard talk about our website, creation.com. Our ministry's in 7 countries, and we have a number of PhD scientists that we have on staff that do research. And these are scientists that have the same kind of degrees as all the other scientists. They do research. We have peer-reviewed journals, and so we draw on, people like me draw on the information that they have done, their research, to present to you. And I told somebody already this morning, that I have a grandson who's almost 11 years old, and he doesn't like dinosaurs. He's weird. Now, I love the fact that he's weird. Dude, don't you know what I do for a living? I talk about dinosaurs all the time. But yeah, so we're going to get into that today. It's Saturday morning. My wife and I have this running gag. Many years ago, there was a Canadian Tire commercial. It started off with a shot of people sitting around the kitchen table, and the line was, "It happens once a week, usually after the second cup of coffee. It's called Saturday." And I guess the idea was you go to Canadian Tire on Saturday, right? So our gag now is Saturday doesn't start until after the second cup of coffee, so my Saturday's good to go. And here we are talking about mutations and things like dinosaurs on a Saturday morning. All right, so here we are in September, and I've already been thinking about Christmas a little bit. And I don't know if I've ever gotten a cheer for that before. And I had this idea for a Christmas card. I started with this, and then I added this. Because nothing says Christmas like dinosaurs, right? I mean, all right, well, okay, how about something a little more traditional? How about a nativity scene? Mary and Joseph, the baby, you got, some animals, right? Now, I realize this picture looks a little weird. It's because it's not to scale. I had to shrink those guys down to make them fit. Now, the reason this picture probably looks a little weird to us is we're not really used to picturing dinosaurs when we read something in the Bible. In fact, we're probably not really used to picturing dinosaurs alongside people at all, right? And that's probably because of images like this. Anyone ever see something like that anywhere? Maybe at a museum or in a book, right? Maybe a movie, right? Anybody remember The Land Before Time? Right? Yeah, you're as old as me? Okay. So this is supposed to be a depiction of what's called the age of dinosaurs. This period of time, we're told, in which dinosaurs roamed the earth, and there were hardly any mammals, there were no modern birds, there were no people. Usually there's volcanoes, weird-looking plants, right? And this is kind of the scene that we get. And this is based on the geologic column. All over the world, there's many very thick layers of sedimentary rock that are full of fossils. Now, evolutionists tend to read the fossil record like it's a history book of the earth. Because in those layers, you got all these fossils, and the idea is that the lowest layers are the oldest ones. They form slowly and gradually over millions of years. And so down at the bottom, you've got fairly simple creatures, things that live at the bottom of the ocean. As you get higher and higher into the upper layers, you get reptiles, and you get dinosaurs and mammals, and eventually you find some humans up near the top. Right? And so the idea is that all these things evolved over millions of years in those layers of rock. And so you get these layers that have been dated from, I believe it's about 230 million years ago to about 66 million years ago. And those are the layers where we find all the dinosaur fossils. Right? And so if that's a representative of a period in time, as they say, then, well, that's where you get this notion of the age of the dinosaurs. And so we get depictions that look like this. But see, that's kind of hinged on the idea that those layers of rock formed very slowly and gradually over millions of years. Well, what if they didn't? Now, I'm going to tell you that, okay, some of these topics we're doing are going to overlap a little bit. So if you were here last night, I'm going to get into a couple things that were already mentioned once. For example, last night we talked about Mount St. Helens, right? We take a look at this and we see these layers of rock here, right? And we've been told layers of rock take millions of years to form, but what really happened here is that Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. And what happened there is 3 distinct single-day events caused the formation of those different layers of rock you see there. That whole cliff is about 130 feet high, right? And 2 different eruptions happened about a month apart. We got those first 2 layers, and then we get mud flows came down from the mountain almost 2 years after that, and you get that 3rd layer. And in the middle layer, as we mentioned last night, there's all these fine layers that are called laminae. Normally, 1 or 2 of those layers get laid down in the course of a year, but in this case, there were 25 feet thick of those layers got laid down in 3 hours. So what this does is this demonstrates that layers of rock can form very, very quickly. We don't have to assume millions of years, right? Now, as I mentioned, in those sedimentary layers, there's all these fossils. Right? And we talked a little bit last night about some examples of fossils that have very clearly been buried rapidly. That in order for a living thing to become a fossil, it has to be buried rapidly or it disappears and there's nothing left to be a fossil. And Richard talked about jellyfish last night. Right? We find jellyfish fossils. Well, what's weird about this is that you'll probably heard of Charles Darwin, right? Well, he was a guy in his time, he believed the layers of rock were millions of years old. He thought fossilization was a slow process. So he assumed that soft-bodied creatures like jellyfish couldn't possibly be fossils because they would disintegrate long before they got covered up and preserved. But we find these jellyfish fossils all over the place. And they look exactly like jellyfish that are still around today. And yet the fossils are supposed to be 500 million years old, which is to say they didn't change. It's called a living fossil, right? Now that's a term that evolutionists don't really like to use much anymore because it sort of highlights the fact that here's an example of something that didn't evolve. So I don't want to talk about that very much. Here's another really interesting one. This is actually 3 fossils all in one spot, 3 creatures. Now, if we diagram this out, what we've got here is a pterosaur, and in the throat of the pterosaur, there's this small fish, and then on the back of the pterosaur, there's a larger fish that's sort of been impaled or stuck into the back of the pterosaur, right? And they're fossilized in that position. So researchers have suggested that what happened here is the pterosaur came swooping down to the water to grab that little fish, got him in his mouth, just going into his throat, and right at that precise moment, this larger fish came up out of the water to try to get the smaller fish, most likely, and got stuck on the back of the pterosaur. But the fun part is, they're preserved in exactly that position. It's like a Polaroid picture. Who remembers Polaroid, right? It's a snapshot in time, and they're fossilized like that. They got buried very, very quickly. Right? And so that's an example of rapid burial. Now, we talk about dinosaurs, and we say, well, what's the point of this? Well, I mean, here we are. Why do Christians want to talk about dinosaurs at all? Does it really even matter? Does it have any effect on the way people think about the world? Or maybe does it have any effect on people's faith? Well, there's a guy named Tom Holland, the historian, not the guy who played Spider-Man. Okay, he wrote a book, and he talks about, he's a Christian, he talks about his faith journey. And he wrote, first there were dinosaurs. I vividly remember my shock when I opened a children's Bible, and I found an illustration on its first page of Adam and Eve with a brachiosaur. 6 years old I may have been, but of one thing I was rock solid certain. No human being had ever seen a sauropod. A faint shadow of doubt for the first time had been brought to darken my Christian faith. Think about this. 6 years old. What happens when you go, let's say you go to the library, you pick up a little children's book about dinosaurs, open it up. What's it going to say on the very first page? Millions of years ago, dinosaurs roamed the earth, right? That's what we see that all the time. Okay? And so 6 years old, this young Christian man, he knows something about the Bible. He doesn't see dinosaurs mentioned in there anywhere. And as far as he knows, dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, long before people were around. And so right away, his assumption is, couldn't possibly have been any dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden or anywhere around while there were people on the earth, because he's been taught something totally different. This has already affected his faith in the Bible. Another fellow said this: dinosaurs were my gateway drug to atheism. And while I was still 6 or 7 years away from reaching the conclusion that God either didn't care about us or didn't exist, the dinosaurs had shared an important secret, that the Bible can be wrong. This kind of thing happens all the time. Talked about this a bit last night, how people look at what the Bible says and then they look at what the science textbooks are saying about billions of years and dinosaurs millions of years ago, and they say, well, there's an obvious difference here. And so people wind up making a decision to believe one or the other, and unfortunately, many times they believe the billions of years and they leave God out of it. And so it does really matter how we understand dinosaurs. As Christians, we should be thinking about everything biblically, right? We should be thinking about everything in a biblical framework. So if we think about dinosaurs, we can say that dinosaurs certainly have existed at some point in time. There's loads of fossil evidence. And according to the Bible, God created the heavens and the earth and sea and all that's in them in 6 days. So God must have created dinosaurs at some point in time. So if we start thinking about the Bible's history and we think about these dinosaurs, where do they fit in? Particularly if they are millions of years old, like we've been taught. Well, some suggest that maybe these dinosaurs go in before creation week, even before day one, because they're millions of years old. Well, we touched on this last night, right? Remember in Genesis 1:31, God saw everything he had made and it was very good. Well, that's at the end of day 6. He's calling everything very good. But if these dinosaurs are already millions of years old and the fossils are already in the ground before creation week happens, well, then that means you've got all these dead things in the ground, and it makes you wonder, well, why would God call that very good? And then we talk about sin a little bit. In case you were wondering, are we going to talk about sin today, right? The Bible tells us the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. This is the gospel message. And it all hinges on the idea that because Adam sinned, death came into the world, physical and spiritual. We need a Savior because of that. But if these dinosaurs, now we know this from Genesis 2, where God said you can eat from any tree in the garden, but if you eat from that tree, you will surely die. And we know that that's what happened. Adam and Eve ate the fruit, they sinned, and then they began to physically die. They died spiritually. But if those dinosaurs were around for millions of years prior to all of that happening, then that means there was already millions of years of death going on before Adam sinned. And if death is not the result of Adam's sin, then the gospel just doesn't make sense. And this is one of the stumbling blocks that people will come across. If dinosaurs are millions of years old, how do we understand the gospel? How do we understand the idea of sin and judgment? So another option that people have is say, well, maybe those dinosaurs came along after creation week. Well, I mentioned last night these chronogenealogies in the Bible that give us kind of a limited timeline from Adam to Abraham and Abraham all the way up to Jesus. There's only a few thousand years allowed for in there in biblical history, so there's no room for millions of years in there. So it kind of makes sense for the fossils to come into play after Adam sinned because they represent death. But the millions of years is a problem. That doesn't really fit. And yet we still have these dinosaur fossils. God had to have created dinosaurs at some point in time. Now I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a handful of questions today. And what I want you to do is I want you to forget what you learned in school. Parents, you're going to love this. Any teachers in here? You're gonna love this, because I'm gonna give you permission, children and adults. When I ask you a question, I want you to, don't raise your hand. I want you to yell the answer out at me, okay? Nice and bold, all right? And the more people that do that, the better. So forget what you learned. You can go back to that stuff on Monday, okay? So I'm going to ask you a question right here. This is what I want you to do. Yell out an answer. Okay, we look at Creation Week. Think about those days of Creation Week and what you know about that. And think about dinosaurs. On which one of those 6 days of Creation Week do you think God created dinosaurs? I heard a 3. What else? Somebody said 6. Anything else? Well, I'll tell you what. If we look at this, we find that on day 5, God created the sea creatures, he created the birds. So that would be the day he probably created things like plesiosaurs, things in the ocean, as well as pterosaurs and things like that. They would all kind of fit in there. Somebody mentioned day 3. That's about land and vegetation, so dinosaurs really aren't there just yet. The word dinosaur refers to a land animal. We'll talk about that in a bit, right? And so God created land animals on day 6. Right? Sometimes we ask people, say, which one do you think is the oldest, the fish, the bird, or the dinosaur? They'll say the dinosaur because they're thinking millions of years, but the fish and the bird are actually a day older than dinosaurs. Things like Triceratops and T-Rex, they would have been day 6. All right, so I'm proposing that God created dinosaurs on day 6 of Creation Week, approximately, according to biblical history, about 6,000 years ago. This is very different from what you're going to read in that little dinosaur book you picked up at the library, right? You're not going to find this in the mainstream literature anywhere. So the question is, there's a verse right here that points out that God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. That's day 6. So the dinosaurs would probably qualify as beasts of the earth. Now, here's the question. Is there any evidence anywhere to suggest that dinosaurs maybe are not actually millions of years old? Maybe they are much younger than that. Well, over the last 30 years, I mentioned, back in 1993, a lady named Mary Schweitzer found this T-Rex bone that she was examining. She took slices off of it, and inside this bone, she found red blood cells. Red blood cells. Now, everybody knows that red blood cells, they don't last anywhere near millions of years old. And to be sure, she ran the test 17 times. Right? Because you find something like that just runs against everything we understand in science. Before you write that down in your paper, you're going to make sure this is what you're seeing 17 times. And later on, she found, I believe in the same bone, she found blood vessels that were soft and stretchy. She pulled it back, they sprang back like an elastic. This kind of stuff really should not be in a bone that is millions of years old. Start with the fact that this bone is obviously not fossilized all the way through. She said in an interview, if you take a blood sample and you stick it on a shelf, you have nothing recognizable in about a week. So why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? That would be the assumption, right? She said, I just got goosebumps because everyone knows these things don't last for 65 million years. And that's not just conjecture, that is scientific evidence that says this stuff doesn't last that long. And of course, she had people in the scientific community who didn't believe that what she was finding was actually red blood cells. She said, I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. Think about this for a minute. She ran the test 17 times. She said, here's the data. Now, science is supposed to be about making observations, looking at the data, and forming conclusions from that. Here's a review and say, I don't care what the data says. It can't be true. Why? Because he's already convinced that that bone has to be millions of years old. Therefore, there can't possibly be any of that stuff in that dinosaur bone. So rather than looking at the actual data, he's holding on to his, last night we talked about presuppositions about the dinosaur fossil, right? And in fact, Mary Schweitzer's kind of doing the same thing. She's finding a lot of these kind of things, and unfortunately, it'd be wonderful to think that she's coming to the conclusion that maybe these bones aren't really as old as we thought because of what we know from science, but instead she's trying to figure out how this stuff lasts millions of years. Meanwhile, everyone else in the scientific community is telling her to keep quiet. You're making us look bad by finding this stuff. But over those last 30 years, there's now been dozens of discoveries of various types of soft tissue in dinosaur bones. There's the blood cells, there's proteins and collagen. We talked about DNA. I think Richard mentioned this last night. DNA could possibly last up to 6.8 million years if it's kept frozen constantly. But of course, these fossils are found in places where the temperature goes up, and then it doesn't last anywhere near that long. We find carbon-14 in some of these fossils as well. Now, you may have heard of carbon-14 dating, and it's a method that gets used. It's somewhat semi-accurate at times, but it requires certain assumptions in order to work. Why? Because you weren't actually there at the beginning to measure properly. Basically, what happens is carbon-14 forms in the atmosphere. Cosmic rays hit the nitrogen-14 in the atmosphere. You get carbon-14. Now, it's an unstable form of carbon. That just means it'll lose particles over time, whereas carbon-12 is a stable form of carbon that we all living things have. It doesn't change, right? But after a living thing dies, it absorbs carbon-14 through its lifetime, both plants and animals. After that thing dies, the carbon-14 stops being replaced and it starts to diminish, right? Because it starts to decay, right? And so that means the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 goes down, right? Because one diminishes, the other one stays the same. And so the proverbial clock, if you will, starts ticking. And here's where the dating method comes in, right? We know that the half-life or the decay rate of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. So something dies, there's a certain amount of carbon-14 there. After 5,730 years, you're gonna have half as much carbon-14 as what you started with. And then another 5,730 years, you're gonna have half again, so a quarter, an eighth, and so on. Eventually you get down to the very last atom that decays, and then you got nothing, right? And so the idea is you take a fossil, you measure the amount of carbon-12 and the amount of carbon-14, apply the decay rate, and you should be able to figure out how long it's been since that thing died. Here's the thing. Carbon-14 becomes undetectable after 50,000 years. I'm not suggesting that there's anything out there that's 50,000 years old, but if you've got a fossil that's supposed to be millions of years old, there's no way there should be any carbon-14 in it. Operational science tells you that. Now, there's other things we need to take into account. We need to calibrate for the amount of carbon-14, take Noah's flood into account. But we find carbon-14 in the dinosaur bones. We find it in diamonds. We find it in coal, places it should not be if those things are millions of years old. Not a problem, of course, if they're not millions of years old. This got highlighted at a conference a number of years ago. Some scientists had some fossils that they brought forward, dinosaur fossils, I believe, and they presented the findings where they'd found carbon-14 in these fossils and presented dates, I think something like 30 to 50,000 years old. Now, initially this was accepted into the conference, but then the people that ran the conference realized, wait, this is a bit of a problem. So they kind of took their seminar title or whatever it was off from the schedule, off the website. And then they wrote a letter, the organizers wrote a letter to the scientists, and they said, there's obviously an error in these data. Because you shouldn't be getting carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone, right? Same reason that those red blood cells can't be red blood cells. You shouldn't have carbon-14 in those fossils. And so again, they forgot about the data and they said, no, we're pretty convinced these are millions of years old, therefore your data must be incorrect. I had a chance to see this guy out at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. He's a nodosaur that got dug up in Fort McMurray. Now, what's interesting about this fella is he's not just a bunch of flattened bones in a rock like so many fossils. There's a whole lot of flesh there. It's basically mummified, right? There's a lot of flesh. There's skin, there's armor, there's pigment in the skin, very rare in a fossil find. Now, researchers have studied this thing. They say, well, probably about 18 feet long. They figure it was buried upside down in fast-flowing water. And here's this. Take a look at this picture. What do you figure those speckles are? Again, you can yell out something. Somebody said red blood cells, not bad. I didn't catch that one. What researchers have determined is that these are the remnants of this creature's last meal. The last thing that this thing ate. And they tell us this thing is 110 million years old. You ever had a meal last that long? I know they repeat on you once in a while, but really, come on. Now, they've since determined that that last meal consisted of plants that, according to evolutionary history, hadn't even evolved yet. Throws the whole timeline out of whack. Researchers are baffled by this whole thing. They said, you know what? We don't just have a skeleton. We have a dinosaur as it would have been. Right? Never mind the skeleton. This is like digging up a dinosaur just the way it would have been when it was walking around. And one of them, actually, an expert on dinosaur skin and pigment, said this thing might have been walking around a couple of weeks ago. Okay, maybe not a couple of weeks, but maybe not millions of years either. So we look at this and we say, well, okay, we've got evidence that says dinosaurs are not millions of years old. And biblically, we'd say, well, God must have created dinosaurs sometime during creation week, probably day 6. So why aren't there any dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? Right? That's one of the big questions that people come up with. It's in that answers book we talked about. Well, see, the word dinosaur actually was invented in 1841 by a guy named Richard Owen. It means terrible lizard. Now, nowadays, we know dinosaurs are a little bit more unique than this, but at the time, they thought dinosaurs were just really big lizards. And so he came up with this word to describe these kinds of creatures that they were digging up, these fossils that they were coming up with, right? Now, English translations of our Bible go back hundreds of years before that. King James in 1611, for example. So in other words, when the Bible was translated into English, the word dinosaur didn't exist. They couldn't have used that if they'd wanted to. They won't use it now because it's kind of controversial. But I wonder if there's anything else in the Bible, any other words in Scripture that might refer to dinosaurs. Well, take a look at Job 40. There's mention of behemoth. God says to Job, behold behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Now, God is extolling his magnificent creation to Job. He's saying, look at behemoth. I made this creature just like I made you. And he's saying, behold behemoth, which tells me that Job would have been able to potentially go and look at a behemoth. Right? Here's something that Job would recognize. It'd be like I said to you, behold the CN Tower. Now, if you've never seen it or you've never seen a picture of it, that wouldn't mean anything to you. Right? So God is saying, look, here's something I created. You know what this is. Gives a description. First of the works of God. Bones are tubes of bronze. And what the tail stiff like a cedar. You'll probably have the cedars of Lebanon in view here, right? A tail stiff like the cedar tree. Now, if you have a Bible with footnotes, it might say something in there that this maybe was an elephant or a hippopotamus, right? Now, let's understand that, of course, the footnotes in your Bible, if you have them, they're not the inspired word of God, right? They're well-meaning comments from scholars who want to help us understand some things, but they can make mistakes, right? And so they come up with it. Now, let's examine this a little bit. Look at the description, and then let's take a look at an elephant tail. Does that look like a cedar tree to you? How about a hippopotamus? It's even worse. I'm not seeing cedar trees here. I'm not seeing something you can make your tail stiff like a cedar, right? And then what about this business of the first of the works of God? Well, doesn't that give you the idea that we're talking about something really big? Well, there's whales that are way bigger than elephants and hippopotamuses. So these don't seem to quite match that description as fully as they should. So if that's the case, then why would these commentators put in the footnotes elephant or hippopotamus? My guess is that because they have a hard time imagining that Job may have seen something like that. This matches the description of a sauropod dinosaur much better than anything else. Researchers know that these guys could swing their tail like a club. Of course, you would have to make it kind of stiff in order to do that, right? First of the works of God, iron tubes, limbs like bars of iron, matches the description much better. I heard somebody earlier say Leviathan. Go to Job 41, and again, here's another creature that God describes. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? His back is made of rows of shields shut up closely as with a seal. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. What does this sound like to you? Sounds like a dragon, doesn't it? Wait a minute, but aren't dragons just mythical creatures? Come on. Because God is describing another creature that Job would recognize. Be able to go and look at one if he wanted to. The question is there anything in the fossil record that might qualify as Leviathan? Now, there's a few candidates. One of them is Sarcosuchus imperator. Repeat after me. Never mind. Oh, that's cool. All right. Well, here's the thing. Sarcosuchus looked a whole lot like a crocodile, but it was a little bit bigger. Here's a Sarcosuchus skull next to a human skull. You want to meet one of those? Huh? Or here's a Sarcosuchus skull next to a crocodile skull. See, it was very much like a crocodile, but it would grow up to 40 feet long. The head itself would be like 6 feet from snout to the back. Massive. Now, one of the things we know about Sarcosuchus, certainly we expect it would have had this armor, plates like a shield, like that description. It also had a bulbous cavity at the end of its snout, this little empty chamber in there. Now, nobody knows for sure what that chamber was for because we just have the bones, right? But it's possible that Sarcosuchus was able to maybe mix together some sort of chemicals or something that would create sparks and smoke and maybe fire even. Because you see, we know the bombardier beetle, for example, carries 2 different chemicals in its hind end in different chambers. And when it's threatened, it can mix together those chemicals and shoot out a hot, burning liquid with a popping sound out at its predator, right? But it can carry these chemicals around every day without incident. And so it's possible that Sarcosuchus may have been able to do something similar. Maybe carry some chemicals around in the snout, maybe make sparks and smoke, and you get the notion of a fire-breathing dragon. Now, dragon, that's another word we find in the Bible, especially in the older versions. In Deuteronomy 32:33, it says, their wine is the poison of dragons and the cruel venom of asps. Dragon is sometimes used symbolically in Scripture, but it's also used to refer to a real creature many times. In this case, we know asps are real creatures. Used in the same sentence here is the dragon. Or in Psalm 91, thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under feet. Nobody has any issue with lions and adders being real creatures, but here they're mentioned right alongside dragons as though dragons are real creatures. Now, dragon is, that's a term we come across all over the world in different cultures, different artworks, artifacts, legends. Consider the Chinese zodiac, for example. You got all those 12 different animals, right? You get the year of the rat, you get the year of the tiger, the year of the dog, and so forth. And you get the year of the dragon. Now, does it make sense? A culture would come up with 11 different recognizable creatures and one mythological one that's totally made up? Or does it make a little more sense that maybe the dragon refers to an actual creature that people actually saw? Who here can tell me what this says? Did a little Chinese last night, we'll do some more this morning. Who can tell me what that says? Anybody? What did he say? These two characters together mean dinosaur. Now, let's take a look at just the second one by itself. What does that mean? Good guess. That is the character for dragon. Now, isn't it interesting that in the Chinese language, you've got the character for dragon incorporated into the term for dinosaur, as if somebody kind of recognized a similarity there. In fact, maybe they were kind of one and the same thing, just different terms. Who here has ever heard of Marco Polo? Read about him in grade 5, right? He went to China, saw all kinds of weird things, and he wrote in his journals. One of the things he wrote was, in this province live huge snakes and serpents of such a size that no one could help being amazed even to hear of them. They are loathsome creatures to behold. They have enormous heads and eyes so bulging that they are bigger than loaves. Their mouth is big enough to swallow a man at one gulp. Their teeth are huge. All in all, the monsters are of such inordinate bulk and ferocity that there is neither man nor beast but goes in fear of them. They go to the dens where lions and bears and other beasts of prey have their cubs and gobble them up, parents as well as young. Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. And here's something big enough to swallow them up. Description from Marco Polo. And does he have any reason to make this up? Probably not. John of Damascus is one of the later church fathers, the leaders that came along in the church after the apostles. And he wrote about dragons in Scripture, where they're sometimes mentioned as real creatures. And he wrote this. Dio the Roman, who wrote the history of the Roman Empire and Republic, reports the following. One day when Regulus, a Roman consul, was fighting against Carthage, a dragon suddenly crept up and settled behind the wall of the Roman army. The Romans killed it by order of Regulus, skinned it, and sent the hide to the Roman Senate. When the dragon's hide, as Dio says, was measured by order of the Senate, it happened to be, amazingly, 120 feet long, and the thickness was fitting to the length. So one of the later church fathers, investigating the concept of dragons as real creatures, comes across a Roman historian who tells about an encounter that the Roman army had with a dragon, and the Senate backed up that story. Now we see dragons depicted all over the world in different legends and different artworks. Here's one on the flag of Wales, dates back at least as far as 1400. Maybe you've heard the legend of St. George and the dragon, goes back to about the 15th century. St. George was considered a hero for ridding the countryside of this dragon that was terrorizing people, right? Now, I say it's a legend, but usually legends are based on something, even though they may get embellished over time. In Scandinavia, you get Beowulf and the dragon. This concept of a dragon just keeps coming up over and over again from all of these different cultures. Remember last night, Richard pointed out all of the flood legends from all over the world, and how doesn't it make more sense that everybody remembered something about the global flood rather than there being 500 different local floods that were all kind of the same? All over the world, you get these legends about these creatures referred to as dragons. I wonder if maybe what Beowulf saw looked something like that. What if what people call dragons are what we would call dinosaurs today? Here's an interesting admission from an encyclopedia a few years ago. They said the dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like the great reptiles, dinosaurs, which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on earth. Interesting. Paleontologists have had to admit there's some kind of a correlation between dragons and what we would call dinosaurs. In fact, they came across one a few years back, looked so much like a dragon, they called it Dracorex hotwartzia. Take a look at the shape of the head and everything, right? Up on the banner, it says it's a new type of dinosaur that looks like a dragon. Well, maybe they're the same thing. Now, truth be told, Dracorex is actually, I'll get to this in a minute. National Geographic published a picture of what they thought Dracorex's head would look like with skin on it. It looked like that. I just saw the Hobbit movies, man. That kind of looks like what I saw in the movie, right? Now, truth is, Dracorex is just a juvenile version of a larger dinosaur. There's hundreds of different dinosaur species that you'll read about. In many cases, some of them are just different stages of development of the same kind of dinosaur. But still, you get this juvenile dinosaur who has a head that looks very much like descriptions of dragons that we have come across. Go to Angkor, Cambodia. There is a temple there. And you can see this pillar where there's a bunch of different sculptures, many different recognizable creatures depicted there. There's a monkey, there's a water buffalo, and then there's this. Who can tell me what this looks like to you? Somebody said dinosaur? Any more specific than that? You know, people all over the world, children especially, have looked at this picture. They see the plates on the back and everything, and they say, that looks like a stegosaurus. Was it a stegosaurus? Maybe, maybe not, but it certainly looks like one. Now, the question is, how do any of you know what a stegosaurus looks like? Right? If you look at something and you say, that looks like a stegosaurus, what's that based on? It's probably because of something you saw in a museum, or a book, or the land before time. Right? That's what we're told these things look like. Well, how would this artist 800 years ago know what a stegosaurus looked like? How did he come up with that? Did he make it up, or did he actually see something like that, perhaps? In China, there's this wine goblet that was found from the 3rd century BC, and on it there's these little carvings, these little moldings of what looks like a tiny little dinosaur. It's got a long neck, it's got a tail, got an interesting looking head. And some suggest that this thing might just be a cat. Now, I've never seen a cat with a neck that long, so I'm not sure it quite fits the description of a cat. But it does sort of fit the description of a Camarasaurus. This is a type of dinosaur. The skull looks like that, sort of matches what's on that goblet a little bit. Here's a picture of the skeleton. Right? Kind of matches that, what's on the goblet, a little bit, certainly better than what a cat would do. Kind of causes us to wonder whether maybe the person who made that goblet, did they see something like this? Were they inspired by that? Go to Carlisle Cathedral in the UK. You can go there and you can ask to see the tomb of Bishop Bell, who died in 1496 and was buried in the floor of the cathedral. And around the top of the tomb, there's these brass engravings of a bunch of different types of things on these brass engravings. Now, here's another chance. I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to go ahead and yell out what you see in the picture on these brass engravings on this tomb. What does this look like to you? It's a bird. What about this one? Someone said a dog. What about that one? Is it a fish? What about this one? Dinosaur. I heard two things. I heard dinosaur and I heard what the. Right? It does, though. It does look like a couple of sauropod dinosaurs with the necks intertwined. The tails are a little different there, but it's like, well, wait a minute. I said 1496. Now, we can understand where he could come up with a dog and a fish and so on, but how does an artist come up with this? Did he make it up, or did he see something like that? Or maybe somebody had described it to him. So what I'm getting at is there's not only evidence that there were dinosaurs in the Bible, the dinosaurs are not millions of years old, but that dinosaurs even have been around, that people have seen dinosaurs since biblical times. Well, then, doesn't that mean that somehow dinosaurs must have survived Noah's flood? Richard touched on this last night, right? Dinosaurs must have been on the ark. Well, that's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, look at the size of those things next to that little bitty ark. How is that possible? Well, somebody said it just now. Okay, maybe you've seen this in a Sunday school. It's really cute, makes a great coloring page, but it is not biblically accurate. We heard last night, the ark was huge. It was 300 cubits long, which is 450 feet with an 18-inch cubit. 75 feet high or wide, 45 feet high. It had 3 decks, all kinds of room in there. One calculation says that the ark would have held the equivalent volume of 522 railway stock cars. Think about how much you could get into those. Lots of volume. Get an idea here, compare that to the size of a jet. Now, as Richard mentioned last night, maybe you could get one of the big dinosaurs in there if you cut away the decks in one area, but you wouldn't have to, right? Because as far as we know, all dinosaurs started the same way. They all started as eggs. Now, the biggest dinosaur eggs that we know about could get as much as 24 inches long. Most of them were no bigger than a football. I'm not suggesting that Noah took a bunch of dinosaur eggs on the ark. Who would hatch them? Okay, who's thinking about Noah sitting on a dinosaur egg right now? You wouldn't have to, but obviously there's a difference between an egg and the massive dinosaur. Now, first of all, not all dinosaurs were huge. Some of them were as small as a chicken. The average size of all dinosaurs that we know of was about the size of a buffalo. But even the big ones started off small, and as Richard pointed out, you don't have to take the big ones. Take the juveniles, because we know from studying the leg bones, you can study the growth rings and the leg bones of these dinosaurs, and we see that they went through a growth spurt. They were relatively small for the first few years, and then after a few years, they kind of shot up just like your teenager, and they ate everything in sight. This is the growth rate of an Apatosaurus. Grew about 5,500 kilograms a year for a few years. That's the size of a baby elephant every year. You want to tell me that Behemoth was an elephant? So you don't really need to take the big dinosaurs on the ark. Just take the juveniles. And you could even time it in such a way that they're still small and that they don't hit their growth spurt until after the year-long flood, right? I mean, God sent the animals to Noah, right? He could certainly time it that way if he wanted to. And so all kinds of room on the ark for the dinosaurs, all the other animals, the food and everything else. So even if you had that little bitty ark, you'd certainly be able to get the smaller dinosaurs on there quite easily, but you would have a whole lot more room than that for these animals that weren't really any bigger than a giraffe. And like I said before, I think Richard pointed this out last night. You don't need to take two of every species, right? You don't need two of every one of the species of dog or every cat, right? You just need two of each created kind. That's what the Bible talks about. And it's the same for dinosaurs. The ceratopsian kind, for example. We know about Triceratops. There's other ones that are probably within the same created kind. And as far as we know, there's only about 50 dinosaur kinds, right, with different variations within them. So two of each of those. Some of them weren't even very big. So let's go back to this geologic column over here, right? This idea of this age of the dinosaurs based on those layers of rock where we find the dinosaur fossils. And you've probably been taught that after that came the mammals and the birds, eventually the humans, right? And this is supposed to be a history book of the earth, right? Well, it's not actually as clear cut as that. You see, we look at this and we say, well, if we assume the layers of rock took millions of years to form, and this represents a period of time, we'd expect it to be sort of clear-cut, I suppose, if evolution occurred. But on the other hand, what if a global flood actually happened? We might expect it to be mixed up a little bit, a general burial record, but still some commingling. I'm going to show you some more pictures, and again, yell out the answer. What is this? It's a cow. What's this one? What's that? It's a dog. What's this one? Nope. Not a duck. Loon. Everybody goes to loon next. It's not a duck. It's not a loon. Now, I know it looks like a duck, right? And you know the phrase, if it looks like a duck, right? No, this is not a duck. Because you see, this is an artist representation of Gansus. Gansus is a fossil that was found in the same layers where we find the dinosaurs, dated at 120 million years old, at a time when there weren't supposed to be any modern birds like ducks. And so despite the fact that this thing looks like a duck, it can't be a duck because it's in the layers with the dinosaurs. So they had to give it a different name. And we find all kinds of interesting things in those layers of the dinosaurs. We find different birds. We did find different mammals. Richard mentioned Carl Werner last night. You find all these hundreds of different mammals and bird fossils that are all in the museums, dated in the same range as the dinosaurs, but they don't put them in the same room. Right? Now, here's my favorite one. It's the far one on the right-hand side. You don't have to try to pronounce those names there. But what that is a small fossilized dinosaur in the belly of a mammal. Remember I said some dinosaurs were small as a chicken? This is in the belly of a mammal. So not only were mammals alive with the dinosaurs, some of them were eating them. Hey, what'd you have for lunch today? You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Now, paleontologists have actually admitted to this. They know this has been happening. Here's a guy at a museum said, we find mammals in almost all our dinosaur dig sites. These were not noticed years ago. We have about 20,000 pounds of bentonite clay that has mammal fossils that we're trying to give away to some researcher. It's not that they're not important. It's just that you only live once, and I specialize in something other than mammals. I specialize in reptiles and dinosaurs. So here's a paleontologist admitting that they've known about these mammals and birds in the dinosaur layers all along. He just ignores them because he's more interested in the dinosaurs. This is clearly not my grandson. Okay? Now, think about this. Is there any other reason why a paleontologist might ignore the mammal fossils and look at the dinosaurs only? Maybe it's because the same reason why Gansus can't be a duck. Same reason why red blood cells can't be red blood cells. Same reason why you can't find carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone. It throws that evolutionary timeline totally out of whack. Maybe even it's the same reason why you don't want to put the mammals and the dinosaurs in the same room, even if they're supposedly the same age. You don't want people to question that. Somebody wrote here, at present, over 120 avian species are known from the Mesozoic from all continents except mainland Africa. That is 120 avian species, including a bunch of modern birds, weren't supposed to be around, and yet there they are in a layer of rock with dinosaurs. So let's go back to this again, this supposed timeline, the age of the dinosaurs. Supposed to have the mammals and the birds come along later. And yet we find those mammals and those modern birds in those same layers. Incidentally, you might have heard the notion that dinosaurs evolved into birds, right? Maybe you've heard that. Well, there's some challenges with that. There's been some supposed feathered dinosaurs found, not really well substantiated, because what we find is these little things that they call proto-feathers, which really could just be little bits of skin. There's no real indication that they were feathers. But you know what? Even if dinosaurs did have feathers, it doesn't mean they evolved into birds. But there's some other issues with the timeline. Sinosauropteryx is considered a feathered dinosaur. It's got these little things that they think are feathers. It's been dated at 125 million years old. Archaeopteryx, considered by some to be a dinosaur to bird transition. Others, on the other hand, say that it's just a bird, not a transitional fossil at all. And then Confuciornis is an extinct bird, 135 million years old. Now, on the surface, this doesn't look like much. But if you think about this, which one should come first? You should probably have the feathered dinosaur should be the oldest. And then the dino to bird transition should be the next. And then the bird should be the youngest one, right? So really, it should look like that. Right? You've got this is the actual timeline. This is the supposed dino to bird transition, or possibly a bird older than the feathered dinosaur, which should be older than that, older also than the extinct bird. And then you've got this extinct bird that is older than the feathered dinosaur that was supposed to come before that. So the timeline doesn't even work out. Now here's a fossil of a dinosaur. You don't have to pronounce that name again, like I said, but this fossil was found, this dinosaur's fossil was found with the remains of three birds in its stomach. The Confuciornis, the one I told you before. So again, not only were mammals eating dinosaurs, but dinosaurs were eating birds, meaning birds were around with the dinosaurs. A guy named Alan Fiducia is an expert on bird fossils, and he's basically said that Archaeopteryx is not a dinosaur. It is a fully fledged bird, and so he can't really use that as a dinosaur to bird indicator. All right, so we looked at all these different aspects about dinosaurs. The big question now is, what happened to them? We look around today and we don't see any dinosaurs. Where did they go? They may have been around just a few hundred years ago, but we don't see anything now. Here's one theory from Gary Larson. Put that on the cigarette pack. Don't smoke. You'll go extinct. Maybe they missed the boat. I used to think that way before I found out about the growth spurt. Now, there's a number of different theories out there amongst evolutionists, and the most popular one is the asteroid impact theory. This idea that an asteroid hit the Earth 66 million years ago, raised a dust cloud that was so thick that it wiped out the dinosaurs, but not the birds, not the mammals. And there's some other issues with that idea. Now, there's a number of theories. Creationists, of course, would have some different theories as well. How does anything go extinct? My personal favorite is the competition theory. I think we hunted them, for one. Remember St. George and the dragon? We don't play well with other predators. If there was a threat, if there was a mountain lion or a bear around your neighborhood, what do you suppose is going to happen? Yeah, somebody's going to be out there with a shotgun. And I think that's some of what went on with dinosaurs. Now, in case you're wondering how could we possibly do that, consider that we hunted whales to near extinction with a harpoon on the end of a rope. I think we could do that. But that's probably just one of many things, many factors. Other things that lead to extinction, genetic drift, things that happen in the DNA that make certain creatures, make it harder to survive in different environments. Certainly changes in their habitat, probably an ice age within a few hundred years after the flood, like Richard mentioned. And so that would affect the habitat, it would affect the climate itself, right? Not the kind of climate change we hear about now, but definitely an ice age. And then food changes, a lot less vegetation after the flood. Drought would be a factor, disease. All of these things contribute to the extinction of a species that have nothing to do with wiping them all out completely with an asteroid or anything else. Now, of course, obviously, 90% of the dinosaurs that ever lived, or more, I'm just guessing at a percentage there, would have been wiped out in Noah's flood. We've got the fossil evidence. And one thing we see in the fossil records, when we see these dinosaur fossils, when we get like kind of pretty much a full skeleton, they all have this weird asphyxiation pose, it's called, where the head is tilted way back in the neck. And they determined that this is what would happen if this thing was buried or drowned rather rapidly. That's the pose it would have. And we find that dinosaurs in that position all over the world. Kind of makes sense if a global flood happened and overwhelmed all those dinosaurs. So we go back to what Tom Holland said. Remember that children's book he saw, the children's Bible? With the dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden? Well, maybe they were there. Now don't get scared, right? Because nobody was eating meat, including dinosaurs, until after sin came along. Now we make assumptions about the sharp teeth and the claws. We may assume that means they ate meat, but maybe not. But even at that point, you wouldn't have to worry about a dinosaur in the garden because, hey, nobody's eating meat until after sin. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. The whole idea of dinosaurs living millions of years ago, long before people, is an idea that sets itself up against the knowledge of God and the Bible. It doesn't fit with biblical history. So we have to take that thought captive and understand dinosaurs within the context of biblical history. And Peter tells us, be prepared, give a defense. People are going to ask us questions about our faith, and sooner or later they're going to ask about dinosaurs. And there's lots of great resources available about dinosaurs. There's one called Dinosaur Evidence Demolishes Evolution. Very comprehensive DVD about dinosaurs. Many of the things I mentioned and many more. It's also one of the DVDs that's available as a free one with the magazine subscription. Got some kids' books like Discovering the Truth About Dinosaurs, Exploring Dinosaurs with Mr. Hibb, that little grasshopper you heard about, and Titans of the Earth, Sea, and Air. I mentioned this one last night. Great dinosaur book with lots of information. No millions of years mentioned. Dragons or Dinosaurs is a good book and a DVD version as well, looking at the correlation between dragons and dinosaurs. And here's a Canadian book called Dire Dragons, all about the same idea, that dragons and dinosaurs are very likely the same things. In this book, the author Vance Nelson points out that before the word dinosaur was invented, when they first started digging up what they later called dinosaurs, they called them dragons. No problem using that word dragon for real creatures. Whole chapter and more in the Creation Answers book. And of course, we've mentioned that Creation magazine a few times. You'll find articles on dinosaurs in there quite regularly. And you've got the rest of the day to subscribe to that magazine and get some of those free gifts if that's something you're interested in. Anybody that's still around here tomorrow morning, you can do it tomorrow. But if you're not coming tomorrow, today's the day. All right? So I think I've gone a little bit over my time here. But the good news is I think the next thing is lunch.